Imagine this: the scorching sun beats down on the dusty plains of Mamre. An old man sits at the entrance of his tent, the fabric flapping gently in the dry wind. His name is Abraham, a man known for his faith, but on this day, he has no idea that his life is about to take a dramatic turn. Then, in the distance, three figures appear. They aren't glowing. They don't have wings. They look like ordinary travelers, dusty, tired, and in need of rest. Most people would have glanced at them and gone back to their business. But not Abraham. Something stirs inside him. He doesn't just wave, he runs toward them. He bows low to the ground, as if greeting kings, and begs them to stay. What happens next is astonishing. These aren't just men. They carry a message, one that will rewrite Abraham's future. Because in that moment of radical hospitality, God Himself steps in. A promise is spoken. A miracle is set in motion. And the course of history is changed, all because one man chose kindness over convenience. This is the untold secret behind Abraham's blessings. It wasn't just his faith that moved God, it was his actions. And the most shocking part? He had no idea who he was really serving. So here's the question: what if divine opportunities are passing you by, disguised as ordinary moments? What if the key to your breakthrough isn't in some distant prayer, but in the next person you meet? The answer lies in what happened next, and it will challenge everything you think you know about favor. Most people give only when it's convenient, when they have extra to spare, when they're in the right mood, or when they expect something in return. But Abraham did something radical. When those three travelers stood before him, he didn't just offer them a scrap of bread or a sip of water to send them on their way. He turned hospitality into an act of worship. Picture the scene: a wealthy old man, respected in the land, sprinting towards strangers like a servant. He didn't delegate the task to a slave, he personally arranged for their comfort. He called for Sarah to bake fresh bread, not yesterday's leftovers, but fine flour, the best they had. Then he ordered a servant to prepare a tender calf, the kind reserved for honored guests. He stood by as they ate, not as a distant host, but as a humble attendant, ready to serve. Here's what's shocking: Abraham didn't know these men were angels. To him, they were just weary travelers. Yet he treated them as if they were God Himself standing at his door. And in a way, they were. This moment reveals a profound truth: heaven notices how we treat those who can do nothing for us. The divine promise that followed, the announcement that Sarah would bear a son within a year, wasn't a random reward. It was a direct response to Abraham's heart. He didn't just believe in God's power, he demonstrated God's character through radical generosity. So here's the question: if God sent messengers your way today, would they find you distracted, hesitant, or too busy to notice? Or would they find you, like Abraham, ready to turn an ordinary moment into an encounter with destiny? The difference between a missed opportunity and a miracle often comes down to one choice: the decision to give without expecting anything back. The real test wasn't whether Abraham believed God could do the impossible. The test was whether he would live like it, even when no one was watching. And his actions thundered through eternity. There are meals, and then there are meals that alter the course of history. This was no casual picnic under the oaks of Mamre, it was a moment charged with eternity. As Abraham's guests ate the finest bread and tender meat, something extraordinary was happening beyond the natural. The act of sharing a meal became the doorway to a promise so staggering it defied logic. Consider the details: Abraham didn't rush the encounter. He didn't serve quick rations so the travelers could move on. He created space for sacred lingering, the kind of hospitality where hours slip by unnoticed because the fellowship is more important than the schedule. And in that unhurried atmosphere, the divine announcement erupted: this time next year, Sarah will have a son. The timing is critical. The promise came not when Abraham was praying on his knees, but when he was serving at the table. Not in a moment of solemn ritual, but in the messy, joyful generosity of feeding strangers. This reveals a startling truth: sometimes God's greatest promises arrive disguised as interruptions to our daily routine. Sarah's laughter from the tent doorway frames the scene with raw humanity. Her disbelief mirrors what many feel when blessings seem too late, when the biological clock has stopped ticking, when opportunities appear expired. Yet the miracle wasn't triggered by their perfect faith, but by their imperfect obedience. Abraham believed enough to slaughter his best calf. Sarah doubted, yet still needed the flour. Their actions created the space for God to move. This banquet teaches us that divine breakthroughs often come through ordinary obedience, the daily choice to show up, to serve, to give our best even when the promise seems impossible. The table Abraham set became an altar. The food he served became communion. And the strangers at his tent flap turned out to be the carriers of his destiny. The question isn't whether God can perform miracles. The question is whether we're setting tables where they can be announced. Sarah's laughter echoed through the tent, sharp and disbelieving, when she overheard the promise. "After I am worn out, and my Lord is old, shall I have pleasure?" The raw honesty of her reaction hangs in the air like a challenge, not just to the strangers at her husband's table, but to the very nature of God's promises. This moment cracks open a profound truth about divine encounters: God isn't deterred by our skepticism. The messengers didn't retract their words when Sarah laughed. They didn't pack up their blessings and move to a more faithful household. Instead, they doubled down with a question that pierced through centuries: is anything too hard for the Lord? There's something scandalous about this exchange. The promise wasn't given because Abraham and Sarah had flawless faith, it came despite their very human doubts. Abraham had laughed too when first told he'd father nations. Their journey was littered with half-truths and missteps, from Egypt to Hagar. Yet here, at the intersection of their weakness and God's faithfulness, history pivoted. The real miracle wasn't just Isaac's impending birth, but what this moment revealed about how God operates. Divine promises often arrive when we're least expecting them, through channels we might dismiss, to people who don't feel ready. Sarah's laughter wasn't the end of the story, it became the prelude to her joy. A year later, she would laugh again, this time with wonder as she held her miracle child. This raises a haunting question for modern readers: how many promises have we laughed away? How often have we dismissed the unlikely, the improbable, the too good to be true moments that might have been divine appointments in disguise? The text makes it clear: God's plans aren't derailed by our disbelief, but our participation isn't optional. Sarah still had to conceive. Abraham still had to obey. The promise was certain, but its fulfillment required their cooperation. The takeaway is both comforting and unsettling. Heaven's timetable isn't bound by our expiration dates. Our doubts don't cancel God's promises, but our willingness to engage with them, even through laughter and trembling hands, becomes part of the story. When the divine and the human collide, the results are always unforgettable. Sarah's first laugh was skepticism. Her second would become the sound of destiny fulfilled. Thousands of years later, we are still talking about a meal. Not because the food was extraordinary, but because the act of serving it altered the trajectory of human history. What began as an ordinary afternoon in the desert became a masterclass in how divine encounters work, and how one moment of radical hospitality can echo through generations. The birth of Isaac was just the beginning. From that promised son would come nations, kings, and ultimately, the lineage of Christ himself. All because an old man saw strangers and thought, "I must feed them." This is the staggering power of obedience wrapped in ordinary actions. Abraham didn't build an altar that day, he built a table. Yet that table became sacred ground. Here's what we often miss: the blessing wasn't transactional. Abraham didn't serve to get something. He served because generosity was his reflex. Yet that reflex positioned him for a promise he could never have engineered on his own. This distinction matters: we don't earn miracles, but we can posture ourselves to recognize and receive them. The writer of Hebrews would later capture this truth: do not neglect to show hospitality to strangers, for thereby some have entertained angels unawares. Modern life conspires against such moments. We screen unknown callers. We avoid eye contact with strangers. We're too busy for interruptions. Yet what if the very distractions we avoid are the doors to our destiny? Abraham's story suggests that divine appointments rarely come announced. They arrive as inconveniences, as interruptions, as people who need something from us. The challenge, then, is to live with what we might call holy awareness, the understanding that any ordinary moment might be laced with eternal significance. You likely won't see angels at your door today. But you might see a neighbor who needs help, a stranger who needs kindness, or an interruption that needs patience. These are your Mamre moments. In the end, Abraham's legacy wasn't just his faith, but his faithfulness in the small things. The table he set still feeds us today, not with bread and meat, but with a timeless truth: when we open our lives to others, we open ourselves to God's surprises. The question isn't whether he still works this way. The question is whether we're still watching for him in the unexpected places. Your next divine appointment might not look like a miracle. It might look like a meal, a conversation, a helping hand. And if you say yes, you just might set in motion blessings you'll never live to see the end of. That's how God's math works: one ordinary yes multiplies into immeasurable grace. Abraham proved it. The question is, will we?